The crack of a rifle wasn't what woke 17-year-old Annalise. It was the silence that followed. The familiar rumble of the stagecoach, the jingle of the harness, the snores of the man beside her, all gone. Replaced by a cold that had nothing to do with the Wyoming wind whipping through the shattered window. Outside, under the vast, unforgiving sky, the world had been remade in violence. Her fellow passengers were scattered like fallen leaves, their journey's end written in crimson on the snow. They thought they had taken everything, but they had left her, a forgotten piece in a deadly game with only the biting wind and a silent, watchful stranger for company. The world returned to Annalise, not in a rush of sound, but in a creeping, insidious cold. It was a damp, bone-deep chill that seeped through the threadbare wool of her traveling dress. A cold the rumbling, pot-bellied stove in the corner of the stagecoach had promised to keep at bay. But the stove was now a dead iron husk, its warmth a fleeting memory. The rhythmic jostling that had lulled her into a fitful sleep was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness. Her eyes fluttered open, not to the familiar sight of her mother's steadying hand or the worn leather of her father's journal, but to a splintered tableau of chaos. The stagecoach, a Concorde model she'd noted with detached interest only yesterday, was tilted at a drunken angle, one of its large rear wheels shattered into a starburst of wooden shards. The door beside her hung agape, torn from its hinges. Through it she saw not the bustling streets of Cheyenne, their final destination, but a vast, blinding expanse of white. A low moan escaped her lips, forming a ghostly plume in the frigid air. She pushed herself up her muscles, screaming in protest. A throbbing ache pulsed at her temple, and when she reached up to touch it, her fingers came away sticky and dark. Blood. Her own. The memory was a fractured mosaic. The sudden deafening report of a rifle. The panicked whinny of horses. The lurch of the coach as it careened off the trail. Then a man with a face obscured by a grimy bandana, his eyes cold as a frozen river, leveling a pistol. A woman's scream abruptly silenced. Darkness. She was alone. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She scrambled towards the open door, her worn boots slipping on the angled floor. "Mama," she whispered, the sound swallowed by the immense howling silence of the high plains. "Papa." The scene outside was a desecration. The pristine snow was trampled and stained, a canvas of violence under the cold, indifferent gaze of the late afternoon sun. 2 of the horses lay dead in their harnesses, their powerful bodies contorted in their final agony. The other 2 were gone. A portly gentleman, a salesman of some sort who had droned on about the virtues of a new patent medicine, lay face down. A few yards away, a dark, spreading stain on the back of his tweed coat. The driver and the shotgun guard were slumped over the front box, their forms eerily still. Annalise's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness. She saw them then, her parents, lying near an overturned trunk, their winter cloaks stark against the snow. Her father, a man of quiet strength and scholarly pursuits, was still. Too still. Her mother, who had hummed a gentle lullaby just hours before, was a crumpled figure beside him. "No." Annalise breathed the word, a fragile prayer against the brutal reality. She stumbled out of the coach, her legs unsteady, and fell to her knees beside them. Their faces were pale, their eyes staring sightlessly at the vast, empty sky. They were gone. The warmth of their hands, the comfort of their presence. The entire world they had built around her, all extinguished in a few moments of savage greed. The bandits had been ruthlessly efficient. Trunks were smashed open, their contents strewn across the snow. Clothes, books, personal effects, all deemed worthless, were left to the mercy of the elements. They had taken the strong box, of course, and the horses, and the lives of everyone who had stood in their way. Everyone, it seemed, except her. Why? The question echoed in the desolate landscape. Had they thought her dead? She remembered the blow to her head, the merciful blackness that had claimed her. Perhaps in their haste, they had simply overlooked her, a small, still form in the corner of the looted coach. A forgotten casualty, left behind. A new kind of cold one that had nothing to do with the temperature began to creep into her veins. It was the chilling embrace of absolute solitude. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the western sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The wind, a constant mournful companion, picked up whispering through the tall, dry grasses that poked through the snow. Soon the last of the day's light would be gone, and the temperature would plummet. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. She was 17 years old, a city girl from Philadelphia, taught needlepoint and French not survival in the unforgiving wilderness of Wyoming territory. She looked around wildly, her gaze sweeping across the endless white. The trail was a faint rutted line, disappearing in both directions into a featureless expanse. Miles from anywhere. Miles from anyone. She was going to die out here. The thought was not a dramatic flourish, but a simple, terrifying fact. She would freeze or starve, or be taken by wolves whose distant howls she could already imagine on the wind. Her end would be as quiet and as lonely as that of her parents. As despair began to tighten its icy grip, her eyes fell upon something half buried in the snow near her father's outstretched hand. It was his journal, a thick leather-bound volume filled with his elegant looping script. It was his most treasured possession, a repository of his thoughts, his observations, his very soul. With trembling fingers, she brushed the snow from its cover and clutched it to her chest. It was a flimsy shield against the vastness of her loss, but it was something. It was a piece of him. Huddled against the wreckage of the stagecoach, the journal pressed to her heart. Annalise wept. She wept for her mother and father, for the future that had been stolen from them all. She wept for her own terrifying, uncertain fate. Her tears froze on her cheeks, tiny crystals of grief in the dying light. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruised twilight world. The wind grew sharper, its mournful cry a symphony of desolation, and as the first stars began to prick the darkening canopy, a new sound reached her ears. Not the howl of a wolf, but something else. The soft rhythmic crunch of footsteps on snow. Annalise's head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat. Fear, primal and immediate, surged through her. Bandits, returning to finish the job. She flattened herself against the side of the coach, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A figure emerged from the deepening gloom, moving with a silent, fluid grace that seemed a part of the landscape itself. He was tall and lean, wrapped in a buffalo robe that obscured much of his form. His face was in shadow, but she could see the glint of dark, watchful eyes. He was not one of the bandits. Their movements had been clumsy, loud, filled with a coarse, brutal energy. This man moved like a hunting cat, with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in harmony with this harsh, beautiful land. He stopped a dozen yards from the wreck, his gaze taking in the entire scene of carnage with an unnerving stillness. He saw the dead passengers, the slaughtered horses, the looted baggage. His eyes, dark and unreadable, lingered for a moment on the bodies of her parents, before finally settling on her. Annalise held her breath. She was caught in his gaze, pinned like a butterfly to a board. He made no move, no sound. He simply watched her, his silence more unnerving than any threat. Who was he? A scavenger drawn by the scent of death? A hunter, or something else entirely? He took a slow step forward, and then another. Annalise flinched, pressing herself harder against the cold metal of the coach. He stopped again, as if sensing her fear. For a long moment, the only sounds were the keening of the wind and the frantic thumping of her own heart. Then he did something unexpected. He slowly raised a hand, not in a gesture of aggression, but with his palm open, a sign of peace, known even to a sheltered girl from the East. He held the gesture for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. In their depths, she saw not malice but a profound ancient sadness, as if he was no stranger to scenes of such brutal loss. He was a Native American, an Arapaho, or perhaps a Cheyenne, she guessed from the scant illustrations she had seen in her father's books. A warrior. And in that moment, as the last vestiges of twilight faded and the vast, cold darkness of the Wyoming night descended, Annalise knew with a certainty that defied logic that her fate, for better or for worse, was now intertwined with that of this silent, solitary man. The man remained motionless, his open palm, a silent question hanging in the freezing air. The wind whipped his long, dark hair across a face that seemed carved from weathered stone, all sharp angles and stoic endurance. He wore buckskin leggings and moccasins, clothing that seemed wholly inadequate for the brutal cold, yet he stood as if the wind were a mere whisper. Annalise's fear, while still a live coal in her belly, was being slowly banked by a desperate, dawning realization. He hadn't hurt her. He hadn't approached with a weapon drawn or a war cry on his lips. He was simply watching. Waiting. Slowly, shakily, she rose to her feet. She clutched her father's journal to her chest as if it were a shield. Her legs felt like brittle twigs ready to snap. She was painfully aware of her torn dress, her matted hair, the blood drying on her temple. She must look a fright, a ghost haunting the wreckage of her own life. She tried to speak, to ask who he was, what he wanted, but her throat was tight with unshed tears and terror. The words wouldn't come. Instead, a choked sob escaped her. The man's expression did not change, but he lowered his hand. He took another step closer, his movements deliberate, unthreatening. He stopped at the edge of the trampled snow, his gaze sweeping over the carnage once more before returning to her. His eyes, she saw now, were not cold. They were dark, yes, but held a deep reflective quality like pools of still water that hinted at unseen depths. He gestured with his chin towards the darkening horizon, then back at her, a simple, clear question. What will you do? The unspoken query hung between them more potent than any spoken words. What would she do? Freeze to death beside the bodies of her parents? Try to walk back down the trail, a journey of countless miles with no food, no water, no shelter. Both were death sentences. Her gaze fell upon the real source of the biting wind and the encroaching darkness. They were on an immense flat plain, a featureless expanse that stretched to the horizon. In the waning light, the ground had a strange, milky sheen. It wasn't just snow. It was ice. a vast frozen sheet covering the earth. Her father had mentioned it, reading from a guidebook just a few days ago. The Laramie Plains notorious for their brutal winters and treacherous ice flats. They were on the Alkali Flats, a place where even experienced travelers could lose their way and perish. Desperation was a potent motivator. It stripped away the decorum and prejudices of her upbringing. This man, this silent warrior, was her only hope. He was of this land. He understood its dangers and its secrets. He was survival embodied. Annalise took a hesitant step towards him. "Help me," she whispered the words raw and fragile. "Please." He gave no sign of understanding her words. His focus shifted from her face to the object she was clutching. He pointed a single long finger at the leather-bound journal. Annalise's grip tightened instinctively. It was the last piece of her father she had left. The thought of giving it up was a physical pain. The warrior saw her hesitation. He did not press the issue. Instead, his gaze moved to the wreckage around them. He walked over to one of the open looted trunks. With the toe of his moccasin, he nudged a discarded woolen blanket, half buried in the snow. Then he looked back at her. His meaning was clear. You need warmth. You need protection. He then bent down and, with surprising gentleness, picked up a small tin box that had tumbled from a lady's vanity case. He opened it. It was empty, looted of whatever jewelry it once held. He held it out to her, then made a gesture of eating, bringing his fingers to his mouth. Then he shook his head, a subtle but definite negation. No food. He pointed again to the vast, dark expanse, and none to be found here. He was not threatening her. He was teaching her. In a silent, stark language, he was laying out the grim reality of her situation. She was bereft of everything warmth, food, shelter, direction. He walked back to where he had stood before, his dark eyes once again finding hers. He pointed to himself. Then he pointed east towards the distant dark shapes of what might be hills or mountains, a promise of shelter from the relentless wind. Then he pointed back at her. The offer was unmistakable. I will guide you. I will take you from this place of death. But the unspoken price hung in the air. His gaze once more fell upon the journal in her hands. Annalise looked down at the book. Its familiar weight was a comfort, a tangible link to a life that no longer existed. It was filled with her father's beautiful prose, his detailed observations of the flora and fauna they had seen on their journey west, his philosophical musings, his hopes for their new life in Cheyenne. It was him. How could she trade him away? Then she looked at the bodies of her parents growing indistinct in the deepening twilight. What would they want her to do? Her father, the pragmatist, the man of science and reason. Her mother, whose love was a fierce, protective force. They would want her to live. They would scream at her from the great beyond, to fight to survive, to claw her way back to the world of the living. Her choice was no choice at all. With a heart that felt as if it were breaking all over again. Annalise took a deep, shuddering breath. She held the journal out to him. Her hand trembled violently. The warrior walked forward. He did not snatch the book from her. He paused before her, his height and presence immense in the gloom. He looked from the journal to her face, a long, searching look. It felt as though he were seeing not just the terrified girl before him, but the weight of the sacrifice she was making. Finally, he reached out and took the journal. His fingers, calloused and strong, brushed against hers. The brief contact was surprisingly warm. He did not open the book. He simply held it in one hand, his expression unchanging, and then tucked it securely inside his buffalo robe. The bargain was struck. A life for a memory. He gave a curt nod. Then, without a backward glance at the scene of the raid, he turned and began to walk. He moved with that same silent, purposeful stride, melting into the darkness. For a moment, Annalise stood frozen, a fresh wave of panic washing over her. He was leaving, but then she realized he was expecting her to follow. He had made his offer. She had paid her price. The rest was up to her. She cast one last tear-blinded look at the still forms of her parents. "I love you," she whispered into the wind. "I will live. I promise." Then, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, she turned her back on the only world she had ever known and stumbled forward, following the silent warrior into the vast, frozen darkness of the ice flats. The journey had begun. The world shrank to the rhythmic crunch of the warrior's moccasins on the crusted snow ahead of her, and the ragged sound of her own breathing. The wind was a physical force, a relentless bully that shoved and clawed at her, seeking out every gap in her inadequate clothing. The cold was a living entity, sinking its teeth into her flesh and settling deep within her bones. Her guide, whose name she did not know, moved with an eerie, tireless grace. He set a steady pace, not too fast, to exhaust her immediately, but relentless. He seemed to glide over the frozen ground, his buffalo robe a shield against the elements, his form a dark, unwavering beacon in the star-dusted gloom. The moon had risen a cold, silver disk that offered little warmth, but bathed the ice flats in a spectral light, revealing the terrifying, endless monotony of their surroundings. Annalise's city-made boots, with their thin leather soles, were no match for this terrain. They slipped and slid on the icy patches, and within the first hour her feet were numb, then painfully throbbing. Every step was a fresh agony. Her lungs burned with the effort of drawing the frigid air. The blow to her head throbbed in time with her frantic pulse. She stumbled, her ankle twisting, and fell hard onto the unforgiving ground. The impact jarred every aching muscle in her body. A cry of pain and frustration escaped her lips. She lay there for a moment, the rough, icy surface a shocking cold against her cheek, and considered not getting up. It would be so easy to just lie here, to let the cold take her, to sleep. It would be a quiet end, a surrender to the inevitable. She saw him stop. He didn't turn immediately, but she felt his stillness, his awareness. After a moment he walked back to her, his form looming over her in the moonlight. He looked down his face, an unreadable mask of shadows. There was no pity in his eyes, no soft words of comfort. There was only a stark, silent expectation. He nudged her shoulder with the toe of his moccasin. It wasn't a cruel gesture, but it was firm, insistent. "Get up." Sobbing with a mixture of pain, exhaustion, and self-pity, Annalise pushed herself onto her hands and knees. Her fingers, raw and frozen, scraped against the ice. "I can't," she gasped, the words turning to smoke. "My feet, I can't feel them." He crouched down beside her. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might abandon her, take back his unspoken promise. He had the journal, after all. What did he owe her? But he didn't leave. Instead, he reached out and, with a surprising lack of ceremony, took hold of her foot. He pulled off her flimsy, soaked boot and the thin cotton stocking beneath. Her foot was a sickly, waxy white in the moonlight. He pressed his thumb into the flesh. There was no response. His expression remained impassive, but a flicker of something concern clinical assessment crossed his features. He dropped her foot and stood up. He walked a short distance away to a place where a few hardy, wind-blasted sagebrush plants grew their skeletal branches clawing up from the snow. With a knife that seemed to appear in his hand from nowhere, he cut several of the larger, woodier branches. He returned to her, and with swift, efficient movements began to rub her foot vigorously with the rough sagebrush. The friction was agonizing. It felt like he was scraping her skin with sandpaper. She cried out, trying to pull her foot away, but his grip was like iron. He ignored her protests, his movements firm and methodical as he worked to restore the circulation. He took the other foot and repeated the brutal life-saving process. Slowly, agonizingly, a tingling pins and needles sensation began to return, followed by a deep, burning ache. The pain was excruciating, but it was the pain of life, not the numb prelude to death. He then unlaced his own moccasins. They were larger than her boots, made of thick, oiled hide, and lined with what looked like rabbit fur. He stuffed some dry grasses he pulled from a pouch at his belt into the toes for extra insulation and gestured for her to put them on. Annalise hesitated, looking at his bare feet, now exposed to the brutal cold. He simply stared back, his gaze unwavering. Swallowing her pride and her disbelief, she did as she was told. The moccasins were ridiculously large, but the fur lining was an unimaginable luxury. A wave of warmth, faint but undeniable, began to seep into her frozen feet. He took her ruined boots and tossed them aside without a second thought. Then he took the strips of leather from her boots and with practiced skill used them to bind the moccasins tightly to her ankles, securing them so they wouldn't slip off. When he was done, he stood and simply started walking again. No words were exchanged. None were needed. He had saved her from frostbite, from the loss of her feet, from a slow and certain death. He had done it with a detached efficiency that was both terrifying and profoundly reassuring. They walked on two small, solitary figures in a vast, indifferent wilderness. The hours bled into one another. Annalise lost all track of time. Her world was reduced to the immediate. The next step, the next breath. The dark shape of the man in front of her. He became her anchor, her compass, her entire reality. She started to notice things about him. The way he constantly scanned the horizon, his head turning with a slow, deliberate motion. The way he would occasionally stoop to examine the ground, though she could see nothing but ice and snow. The way he walked with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, a flaw in his otherwise perfect, fluid grace. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hours of the night, when the cold was at its most vicious, he stopped. He pointed to a low, rocky outcropping that offered a meager shield from the incessant wind. "Here," he said. The sound of his voice was so unexpected, it made Annalise jump. It was deep and gravelly, like stones grinding together, and it was the first word he had spoken. He shrugged off the heavy buffalo robe and laid it on the ground in the lee of the rocks. Then he sat down, his back against the stone, and gestured for her to sit beside him. Hesitantly she did, huddling close to the rocks, pulling her shawl tight. The thin fabric was practically useless. She was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering like castanets. He watched her for a moment, his dark eyes seeming to pierce the gloom. Then, with a sigh that sounded impossibly weary, he lifted a corner of the buffalo robe. An invitation. Annalise stared at him. The propriety of her Philadelphia upbringing screamed in protest. To share a blanket, to press herself against this strange, savage man. It was unthinkable. He saw the conflict in her face. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a gesture of impatience. He lifted the corner of the robe again, more insistently this time. The alternative was to freeze. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. With a heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange new intimacy, she shuffled closer and slipped under the heavy robe. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. The thick, cured hide blocked the wind completely, and the fur on the inside trapped the heat from his body. The scent of him was earthy and worn of wood-smoke leather and the cold, clean air of the plains. It was utterly foreign, yet strangely comforting. She sat rigidly, careful not to touch him, but the space was small. Her shoulder brushed against his arm. He didn't react. He sat as still as the rock behind him, staring out into the moonlit emptiness. They sat in silence for a long time. The shivering slowly subsided, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Her eyelids grew heavy. Despite the terror of her situation, despite the strangeness of her companion, sleep began to pull at her an irresistible tide. Just as she was about to succumb, he spoke again, his voice a low rumble beside her. "They will follow the tracks." Annalise's eyes snapped open. "Who? The men who did this?" he said, his gaze fixed on the darkness. "They took the horses, the money. They left you. A witness. They will not have gone far. When they feel safe, they will think on it. They will come back." The blood in Annalise's veins turned to ice, a cold far deeper than the wind could produce. She had been so focused on the immediate threat of the environment that she hadn't considered the human danger. The bandits. The man with the cold eyes. They knew she had seen them. "How do you know?" she whispered. He turned his head then, and in the faint moonlight, she could see his face more clearly. There were lines etched around his eyes and mouth, lines of hardship and sorrow. There was an old, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "I know men like that," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They leave nothing to chance. We must be gone from these flats before the sun is high. On the ice tracks are a map that leads to a grave." He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers. "You must sleep now. There is a long walk ahead, and we will not be the only ones hunting." The implication of his words sent a fresh shiver of fear through her. He wasn't just guiding her to safety. He was hunting too. A silent, deadly game was being played out across this frozen wasteland, and she was now inextricably a part of it. She closed her eyes, but sleep was now a distant shore. She was trapped between the memory of the violence behind her and the threat of the violence that lay ahead, with only the silent, watchful warrior beside her as a shield. And she realized with a chilling certainty that he was every bit as dangerous as the men he hunted. The first blush of dawn was a cruel deception. It painted the eastern sky in delicate shades of rose and lavender, a promise of warmth that the land had no intention of keeping. The temperature had dropped even further during the brief, huddled rest, and the air was so cold it felt sharp in Annalise's lungs. The warrior whose name she still did not know had woken her with a gentle shake of the shoulder before the sun had even breached the horizon. There was no time for lingering. As he had predicted, their tracks from the previous night were etched into the icy snow with damning clarity, a clear trail leading directly from the Stagecoach massacre to their meager shelter. He wasted no time. While she forced her stiff, aching limbs to move, he was already erasing their presence. Using a branch of sagebrush like a broom, he meticulously swept and disturbed the snow around their resting place, blurring the outlines of their bodies, scattering the evidence of their brief pause. His movements were precise, economical, honed by a lifetime of such necessities. He handed her a small strip of dried meat. It was tough and leathery, with a smoky, gamey flavor that was shockingly potent to her unaccustomed palate. But it was sustenance. She gnawed on it gratefully, the salty taste, a welcome shock to her system. It was the first thing she had eaten since a stale biscuit the morning before. "Eat," he commanded, his voice as rough as it had been in the night. "We move fast." He pointed not east towards the rising sun and the distant mountains, but almost directly south into a region of broken rocky terrain that rose from the flats like the jagged spine of some long-dead beast. It looked impassable, a chaotic jumble of stone and shadow. "The rocks will hide our trail," he explained, seeming to read the question in her eyes. "The ice is a messenger. The stone keeps secrets." The journey into the Rocklands was a different kind of hell from the monotonous agony of the ice flats. Here the ground was uneven, a treacherous maze of sharp-edged stones, hidden crevices and steep, sudden inclines. It was a test of balance and endurance. The oversized moccasins, a blessing on the flat ice, were clumsy here, and Annalise stumbled constantly. Her hands and knees scraped raw from her frequent falls. Her guide moved through the labyrinthine landscape with the certainty of a mountain goat. He never seemed to hesitate, his eyes constantly scanning the path ahead, choosing a route that, while difficult, was always passable. He would often pause, waiting for her to catch up, his silhouette stark against the pale morning sky. He never offered a hand, but his patience was a tangible thing, a silent acknowledgement of her struggle. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows across the rocks, Annalise began to see the wisdom in his choice of path. The wind, which had been their tormentor on the flats, was baffled by the rocks reduced to a series of unpredictable gusts and whispers. And more importantly, the hard, wind-scoured stone held no tracks. They were ghosts now, their passage marked only by the occasional dislodged pebble. Sometime near midday, he led her into a narrow, hidden canyon, a deep slash in the earth that was almost invisible until they were upon it. The walls rose steeply on either side, providing shelter and a profound sense of seclusion. A small, snow-fed spring trickled from a fissure in the rock, forming a pool of water so clear and cold it hurt her teeth to drink it. While she drank her fill, cupping the icy water in her hands, the warrior explored the canyon. He moved with a quiet intensity, his gaze sweeping over the rock walls, his hand occasionally tracing the stone. He stopped before a section of sheer sandstone cliff that was sheltered from the elements by a deep overhang. The rock here was smoother, a canvas of faded ochre and charcoal. It was covered in drawings. Annalise approached, her curiosity overcoming her exhaustion. The images were ancient, faded by time and weather, but still powerfully evocative. There were stick-figure men with bows and spears hunting herds of stylized bison and deer. There were abstract symbols, spirals and zigzags, whose meanings were lost to time. And there were handprints, dozens of them stenciled in red and white pigment against the stone, a ghostly chorus of long-vanished people. "Who were they?" she whispered, her voice filled with awe. The warrior stood beside her, his gaze on the petroglyphs. For the first time, she saw a softening in his stern demeanor, a shadow of reverence, of connection. "The old ones," he said, his voice softer now. "They lived in this land when the mountains were young. Their stories are written in the stone." He traced the outline of a bison with his finger. "They knew the secrets of this place, how to live, how to hunt, how to die." His words hung in the quiet air, of the canyon. Annalise looked from the ancient drawings to the man beside her. He was a part of this story, a living link to the ghosts on the wall. His people, the Arapaho, were latecomers compared to the old ones, but they were still woven into the fabric of this land's ancient history. She, with her Eastern dresses and her father's scientific books, was the intruder, a fleeting anomaly. "My father," she began, her voice catching. He would have loved this. He was a historian. He studied the past. She clutched the front of her dress where the journal would have been. The loss was a fresh, sharp pang. The warrior turned his gaze from the wall to her face. His eyes, for a moment, held a flicker of something that looked like empathy. "A man who studies the past should know not to travel the Alkali Flats in winter," he said. It was not a cruel statement, but a simple, hard truth. Her father's knowledge, extensive as it was, had been academic. It had not prepared him for the brutal reality of this land. He looked back at the wall, at a series of drawings that were different from the hunting scenes. They depicted men fighting other men. The figures were more detailed, their postures aggressive. One figure lay on the ground, pierced by arrows. "The stories on the stone are not all of peace," he said, his voice turning hard again. "Men have always fought over this land, for water, for game, for shiny metal." He tapped a finger on a drawing of a figure on horseback, a figure that was clearly not one of the old ones. It was a Spaniard, perhaps from centuries ago, an invader. The implication was clear. The bandits who had attacked her stagecoach were just the latest in a long line of violent men, seeking to take what was not theirs. The story was ancient, its theme unchanging. He pushed away from the wall, his brief moment of contemplation over. "We cannot stay. They will not taught. Search the rocks forever. They will guess we sought shelter from the wind. They will start to search the canyons." As if to punctuate his words, a faint sound echoed from the mouth of the canyon, the distant, unmistakable whinny of a horse. Annalise froze, her blood turning to ice. They had been found. The warrior moved with breathtaking speed. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice, and pulled her deeper into the canyon, away from the entrance. "Quiet!" he hissed, his body tense, alert. He was no longer a historian or a guide. He was a hunter, and he was being hunted. He pressed her flat against the rock wall behind a large boulder that offered some concealment. He drew his long knife, its blade glinting dully in the canyon light. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes now burning with a cold, lethal intensity fixed on the canyon entrance. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of shod horses on stony ground and the low murmur of men's voices. They were coming, the men with the cold eyes. They had found her. Annalise squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs, so hard she was sure they could hear it. She could smell the fear on herself, a sharp, coppery scent. This was it. This was where she would die. In this ancient place, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, her own short, terrified story would come to a violent end. She pressed herself into the cold stone, praying to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, while the silent warrior beside her prepared to meet violence with violence. The voices grew clearer, rough and careless. They echoed off the canyon walls, carrying every profane word. "See anything, Jed?" one man called out, his voice laced with impatience. "Nothing but rocks and shadows," came the reply. "This is a waste of time. She's buzzard food back on the flats by now. The girl's dead." "Coltrane don't think so," the first voice said lower now as the men drew nearer. He says she saw his face clear. Says no loose ends. You know how he is. Coltrane spooked at his own shadow. The one called Jed grumbled. But he's payin', so we look. Annalise's heart leaped into her throat. Coltrane. The name hit her with the force of a physical blow. She knew that name. It had been spoken in hushed, anxious tones by her father in the days leading up to their departure from Philadelphia. Thaddeus Coltrane, a former business partner of her father's, a man ruined by his own greed and reckless speculation, a man who had sworn vengeance on those he blamed for his downfall. Her father had dismissed him as a blowhard, a man of empty threats. He had been fatally wrong. This wasn't a random robbery. It was a targeted assassination. They hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They had been hunted. And the bandits hadn't overlooked her by accident. They hadn't known she was there. Coltrane had wanted her father dead, and now he wanted the witness to his crime silenced. The revelation struck her with the dizzying force of a new reality. The world tilted on its axis once more. Two riders appeared at the canyon entrance, their figures silhouetted against the bright school. They were hulking, bearded men, bundled in thick coats with rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. They were two of the men from the raid. She recognized the grimy sheepskin coat on one of them. They dismounted their spurs, jingling, and let the reins of their horses drop. The animals stood placidly, their breath pluming in the cold air. "Let's check this crack in the earth and be done with it," Jed said, stretching his back. "I want a whiskey and a warm fire." They began to walk into the canyon, their boots crunching on the gravel. They moved with a lazy confidence, two predators who did not believe they were being watched. Beside her, the warrior was a study in absolute stillness. He was coiled like a snake, his entire being focused on the approaching men. Annalise could feel the tension radiating from him, a palpable aura of contained violence. He was no longer just a guide. He was a protector, and he was about to fulfill his part of their silent bargain. He glanced at her, his dark eyes locking with hers for a fraction of a second. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a command. "Stay here. Do not move. Do not make a sound." Then he was gone. He didn't run. He flowed away from her, using the shadows and the boulders as cover, moving with a silence that was supernatural. One moment he was beside her, a solid, breathing presence. The next he was a phantom, melting into the landscape he knew so well. The two bandits ambled further into the canyon, their eyes scanning the obvious hiding places. They walked right past the boulder, where Annalise was hiding so close she could smell the stale sweat and tobacco on them. She held her breath until her lungs burned, pressing herself so hard against the rock she felt its rough texture through her dress. "Nothing," Jed said, kicking at a loose stone. "I told you. Let's go." His companion grunted in agreement and turned. It was the last sound he ever made. From a ledge above and behind them, the warrior dropped. He descended like a hawk, silent and swift, landing on the second bandit's shoulders. The man gave a choked cry of surprise as the warrior's knife, held in a reverse grip, drew a swift, dark line across his throat. He crumpled to the ground without a sound, his rifle clattering on the stones. Jed spun around, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, fumbling to raise his own rifle. He was too slow. The warrior was already moving, a blur of buckskin and fury. He kicked Jed's rifle aside and drove the hilt of his knife into the man's face. There was a sickening crunch of breaking bone. Jed staggered back, screaming, clutching his shattered nose. The warrior gave him no quarter. He followed his advantage, his movements, a brutal, efficient dance of death. He kicked Jed's legs out from under him, sending him sprawling. Before the bandit could recover, the warrior was on him, a knee pinning his chest, the bloody knife held to his throat. "Who sent you?" the warrior snarled, the words ripped from his throat, full of a cold, terrifying rage. It was a different voice now, the voice of a man pushed past endurance. Jed, choking on his own blood, could only gurgle in terror. "Coltrane," Annalise said. The word was out of her mouth before she could think. Both the warrior and the terrified bandit looked towards her. She stepped out from behind the boulder, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a cold, clarifying anger. "His name is Coltrane," she repeated, her voice shaking but clear. "He was my father's business partner. He wanted him dead." The warrior's eyes narrowed, a flicker of understanding dawning in their depths. He looked down at the whimpering man beneath him. His expression was pitiless. "Please," Jed begged, blood and tears streaming down his face. "Please, mister, I was just taking orders. We can make a deal." The warrior stared down at him, his face a mask of contempt. "You deal in death," he said, his voice low and guttural, "and you pay in the same coin." He did not hesitate. The knife moved with a final, brutal efficiency. Annalise flinched and turned away, a wave of nausea washing over her. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the trickling of the spring and the soft stamping of the horses at the canyon mouth. She stood trembling, her back to the scene. She had witnessed violence before, but this was different. This was raw, personal, and terrifyingly intimate. The detached brutality of the Stagecoach raid had been replaced by the swift, merciless justice of the wild. She heard him rise. She heard his footsteps on the gravel as he approached her. She braced herself, not knowing what to expect. He stopped in front of her. She forced herself to look up at him. His face was grim, his buckskins and hands stained with the blood of his enemies. But his eyes, when they met hers, held no malice. They held a deep, weary sadness. He reached inside his buffalo robe and pulled out her father's journal. He held it out to her. Annalise stared at it, then at him, confused. "But the bargain, the debt is paid," he said, his voice returning to its normal, gravelly tone. He pushed the journal into her hands. "He was not just your enemy." He turned and looked back at the bodies. "These men, they're kind. They raid my people. They take our land. They bring whiskey and disease. They killed my wife and my son." The words were spoken in a flat monotone, a litany of loss that echoed the emptiness of the canyon. "The man you call Coltrane, he paid them. His money is poison in this land. Today I fought for you, but I also fought for them." He gestured vaguely towards the stones, towards the ghosts on the walls, towards the memory of his own family. Annalise finally understood. Their paths had converged not by chance, but by the gravitational pull of shared tragedy. His silence had not been one of indifference, but of a grief so profound it had no words. He had seen in her loss a reflection of his own. The journal had not been a price. It had been a symbol, a connection to a world of memory and pain that he knew all too well. He walked over to the bandits' horses. They were good animals, strong and well-fed. He checked the saddlebags. They contained ammunition, a small amount of food, and a heavy pouch of coins. He hefted the pouch, his expression one of disgust, and then threw it as far as he could into the rocks, where it landed with a dull, metallic clatter. He would not touch the poison money. He led one of the horses to her. "Cheyenne is 2 days' ride from here." he said, his voice once again that of a guide. "If you ride hard, stay in the hills, follow the North Star, you will be safe." He was leaving her. The thought brought a surprising pang of fear. She had grown to depend on his silent strength, his unerring knowledge of this land. "What about you?" she asked, her voice small. He looked west towards the vast empty plains that stretched into the setting sun. "My hunt is not over," he said. "The man Coltrane, he is still out there. A snake's head must be cut off." He would not be dissuaded. His was a path of vengeance, a lonely road she could not follow. He helped her into the saddle, his hands firm and impersonal. He placed the reins in her hands, and then looked up at her one last time. "Live," he said. It was both a command and a blessing. "Live well. That is the only vengeance that matters." He gave the horse's rump a slap, and the animal started forward, carrying her out of the canyon of ghosts and blood, back towards the world of the living. Annalise did not look back. She clutched her father's journal to her chest, its familiar weight a comfort and a promise. She rode east towards the distant hope of Cheyenne, leaving the silent warrior to his own dark journey. A man who had guided her across the ice flats and paid a debt in blood. A man whose name she would never know. Annalise's journey was far from over, but she was no longer the frightened girl left for dead in the snow. She carried with her the weight of her past and the harsh lessons of the ice flats. The silent warrior had given her more than just her life. He had given her a purpose, to live to bear witness and to ensure the story of Thaddeus Coltrane's treachery did not end in that frozen wasteland. Her path led to Cheyenne to justice, but his led into the setting sun, a lonely hunt for a snake's head. Their stories, bound together by violence and loss, diverged, becoming another whisper in the long, wild history of the West. If this tale of survival and silent sacrifice captured your imagination, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this story with others who appreciate the untamed spirit of the West, and be sure to subscribe for more original tales of drama, grit, and redemption.